Welcome to your lesson on the cell membrane. Now, the past week or so, we've been learning about all the parts of the cell. For this week, we're going to focus entirely on just the cell membrane. So if you could focus in on the cell membrane, it might look something like this, and we're going to learn what all those parts are. Be sure to write the notes for this lesson on page 19 in your notebook. If you remember, the cell membrane's job is to control what enters and leaves the cell. So it forms a barrier between the cell and its environment. We say that the cell membrane is selectively permeable. That word permeable means can pass through. Passes through. So that word permeable means that things can pass through the cell membrane, but the word selectively refers to the fact that only some things can come through and not others. So I like to talk about it like as though it were a window screen. I'm sure you're familiar with a window screen. The window screen allows the nice breezes to come through, it allows air to come through, but it keeps out these bugs. That's what the cell membrane does. It allows some things to come through, some small things, and sometimes larger things cannot come through. Now, cell membranes are made of these molecules called phospholipids. That word lipid we've seen before. Lipid is a fatty substance. It has actually fatty acids. But phospholipids have this phosphate group on them. Phospho refers to a phosphate group, and what you need to know about that is that it can dissolve in water. If you remember, lipids or fats and oils cannot dissolve in water. So the cell membrane has this property of having this center area here, which is hydrophobic. The water cannot pass through there. It repels water. And then this section, hydrophilic, is the section that does dissolve in water. And so it has this strange property of partially dissolving in water. And that's what cells are. They're partially dissolved in water. The other thing you see in cell membranes are some large protein molecules that are stuck in there. Some of these large protein molecules are for transporting substances, so sometimes things that cannot pass through the membrane will come through just right here, and we'll talk about that. Some of them are communication, so some of these sticking out the top allow cells to communicate with one another, and some of them that stick out the top are just kind of like name tags that identify that cell and what it's doing. Now, the smallest molecules and atoms can pass through a membrane easily. No energy is required. They're small. An example of this is water. I know I said water doesn't pass through, but it really can pass through, and there's a reason for that. It's very small. Also, carbon dioxide, also oxygen molecules, and there are others that can just simply pass through the membrane without any energy being used by the cell. We call this passive transport. Now, because molecules are always moving, they're going to spread out. So substances that are small enough, if they're outside the cell, they will spread out and move inside the cell. If there's a lot of them inside the cell, they will spread out and move outside the cell. We call this diffusion when something moves like that. For example, if you put a drop of dye inside some water, eventually the little dye particles will spread out until they're evenly spread all throughout the whole cup of water. And this happens with all molecules, including those that are moving across the cell membrane. A very specific kind of diffusion we like to talk about is the diffusion of water across the membrane. We call this osmosis. Osmosis is a very special word that means diffusion of water. Because water is small, it can move across the cell membrane passively, and it will. So these little water molecules will move from where there are more of them to where there are fewer of them. Here's a new vocabulary term for you. The word hypotonic refers to a solution with a low concentration of solids. Think of something diluted. Think of if you took some Kool-Aid or some juice and you added a lot of water. That would be diluted. It's a low concentration. In this case, water will move out of a solution, a hypotonic solution, and it will move into the cell. When this happens, if you have a cell in a hypotonic solution, water will move into the cell will fill with water, and it could burst. So something like these red blood cells is filling up with water. and eventually it could burst in a hypotonic solution. Think of it as having a lot of water, and that's why the water goes into the cell. Kind of the opposite of that is this new vocabulary term, hypertonic. Hypertonic solutions have a high concentration of solids. Think of, if you took that juice and you evaporated some of the water and it got really sugary and sweet, even like syrup. This is a hypertonic solution, and water will move into that solution from a cell. So there's a lot of molecules of the solid substance that's in there, and the water will just move right out of the cell and move into that solution. In this case, cells will dehydrate, and they'll shrivel up. They shrink up and shrivel up because they're losing water. Water moves out of them into these concentrated solutions. Hypertonic. Now, what I just showed you were animal cells. Plant cells act a little differently because they have that cell wall that gives them structure. In a hypertonic solution, the cell does not completely shrivel up. You can still see the cell wall, but the contents of the cell begin to shrivel. So you see the cell membrane pulling away from the cell wall here. In a hypotonic solution, because the plant cell has the vacuole, all the water moving into the cell ends up filling up this vacuole, and it becomes very, very full, but it doesn't burst because it has this cell wall that protects it. Now there's a third type of solution called isotonic. Isotonic solutions have concentrations equal on the inside and the outside. So this would be a solution in which all of the solids and water is exactly the same outside and inside this cell. In this case, the molecules are moving in and out of the membrane, but they're moving the same number moving out as moving in. 2 move out, 2 move in. 3 move out, 3 move in. And so the cell remains the same. Now, so far what we've been talking about are molecules that can move without any help. They just move right through the membrane. Some substances need the help of proteins. Sometimes the proteins, as I showed you before, in the membrane, act like a little doorway or a little gate to help these substances to move through quickly. An example of this is glucose. There are little holes specifically in the membrane for glucose. So glucose, even though it's a little bit larger than water or oxygen, it has its own pathway and can travel right through without the cell using any energy, even so. Finally, sometimes the cell needs to move substances across the membrane using energy. It's going against diffusion. So the substances would like to move in by diffusion, but the cell's actively removing them. There are 3 types of this. In the first example, carrier proteins act like little gates and push the molecules out of the cell or push them into the cell using energy. This is the key. In active transport, energy is required. So these carrier proteins act like a little pump to pump it out. Endocytosis is the movement of molecules into the cell through vesicles. We've seen this word vesicle before. This example is shown here, where all of these little molecules are coming in near to the cell membrane. The cell membrane begins to fold. Eventually it pinches off, and now we have a vesicle with all of the particles inside. That's called endocytosis. This frequently will happen if the molecule is very large, like proteins can be brought in this way. Finally, exocytosis is similar to endocytosis, but this is the movement of substances out of the cell by vesicles. So again, the cell will put all of these substances into a vesicle. The vesicle will move to the membrane and fuse here with the membrane and spill its contents out into the area outside of the cell. That is exocytosis. And all 3 of these, carrier proteins, endocytosis, and exocytosis, require the use of energy by the cell. So that's everything you need to know about cell membranes for my class.